Welcome to HiveMind. This is Edge with my co-host Speaker. How's it going?
I'm good. How you doing? It's been a hectic week.
What a week it has been. Oh my gosh. I wish I could tell the listeners everything that's happened to me this week, but some things I just have to keep private. But
Um,
man, it has
thing,
been a week.
things that happen to all of us, really. It's been crazy. This podcast is going to be a little bit shorter. We do apologize, but it's just the fact that we're even recording one this week is a miracle,
Yeah.
considering everything that's going on. But it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to structure it a little bit differently. We're going to be talking about a little bit of and discussing a little bit of comments from you guys as well. So.
Yes. So we were planning on talking about something uplifting because, all of these topics that we've been talking about recently have been really heavy. So we were going to talk about the Great Awakening and give people some inspiration. But of course, we can't do that before we address this big issue at the moment, which is the attempt by big tech and media to silence us and keep people from waking up to the truth. So we've seen a lot of that this week.
Yeah, well, over the last week, some really massive accounts that do some really good stuff. Not all that I agree with, but that's not the point of this. The point is free speech and free information, and it's one of those things where it's these creators to all together, and we're friends with a lot of them, have millions of followers combined.
I
It's
know.
such a tragedy.
I know. Massive blow. Massive blow to the truth community by those accounts being taken down this week. And I was so angry to see that happen because these people, they work they've put their whole lives into this.
Mm.
And to just a click of a button have it taken away because the thought police deemed it to be unacceptable. I mean, how Orwellian is this? I feel like I'm living in 1984. I have never seen it this bad.
Well, this is, and I've tweeted about this, and I've said this a million times. This is a huge criticism I have of this party at the moment, is their lack of effort on anything on the digital social front, and that extremely pisses me off because in the case that you we don't win this next election, you can put a lot of it down to social media and media completely running interference for the other side.
Absolutely. I mean, that is how essential this election is. We are seeing a preview of what to expect if Trump doesn't get back into office. And I not that I'm completely convinced that he will, but if he were to not get back into office, we could see this kind of censorship continue and even worse. And so, what is it that they're so afraid of? Why are they so afraid of waking people up to this truth, to the truths? And there are different accounts that talk about different aspects of things, but what are they so afraid of?
It's the loss of control. It's the loss of their narrative being the only narrative.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They've had control of the narrative for so long that they are scared to death of losing it. But a lot of these people are implicated in criminal activity that is starting to be exposed, with the new information that we have about Hunter Biden and all of that. That's just an example. But the more and more exposure of this, the more their criminal activities are exposed. And I would assume that big tech is at some point involved because of their affinity for shutting this type of conversation down. Like they have a stake in
Mm.
this, right?
Yeah, well, see, big tech is an interesting one on the way that we know they're all controlled and they're all run by uh, one party, which is the opposition party in our case. which is the Democrats. They're all Democrats, from the owners all the way down to the workers to all the way down to the people that censor. It's a flood. Silicon Valley is a flood of Democrats, right? Now this is extremely dangerous for any country to be dominated in a field that's so important, such as big tech,
Yeah.
right? It and that there is criminal activity going on there when it comes to censoring the opposition side. Like this stuff should not be legal. I mean, I remember back in the day when these companies, especially YouTube, which is a real interesting one of where it's gone now, because YouTube used to be a real edgy platform when it first started. It wasn't anything like what you see at the moment. It was very edgy. And it's just kind of gone the opposite way.
Yeah, now they're like 1984's Ministry of Truth. It's
Right, put
insane
it.
the kind of censorship that we're seeing happen there. And a lot of it is directed towards the truth community, people who are out there with these independent channels that are creating their own content and exposing things. And all of this community is part of what we call generally the Great Awakening. And, I think that we really need to talk about the Great Awakening because it is what they are terrified of. And I think different people define it differently. And that's why we asked a lot of our followers to give us their feedback on what it means to them. I think it's a very personal thing, but it's also something that we're going through together globally. And so we need to talk about that. And also, there's different aspects of it. You see physical manifestations of it with, say, protests, for example, but it's also on a psychological level, a psychological warfare that's happening, as well as a spiritual one. So I kind of want to talk about all of these different aspects of the Great Awakening because everybody kind of interprets it differently. But I thought since it is a personal thing to everybody, maybe we should start off by talking about our own personal awakenings kind of briefly. So tell me about your speaker.
Well, Mine's been gradually been happening all through my life. For those that know my story, I've always had a feeling that there was something else going on. I always felt like I was being lied to. It's probably the best way to put it. While other people weren't paying attention to things, I was seeing the cracks. And 5 years ago, I fell into a relationship with a person that happened to be a member of the Dark Triad, and that is when I knew evil was real, and that's when I knew manipulation, lies, and the sort of people that would know empathy actually exist in this world. Not everyone thought like me. Not everyone felt like me. There was actually bad people in this world. And that is when I came face to face with it, and I learned it full on. And then I started to dive into all these other questions and all these other things that have plagued me for years that didn't sit right with me, from certain events in America's history, from things that have happened, from things people have said, from wars. I started looking at all of it, and I started to find the cracks, like what with a lot of us do. So that was really, that's a real shortened version of my awakening and how I found myself here. How about you, Edge?
Well, I started around the same time. It was like 5 or 6 years ago. And I just wanted to know more about my grandfather. And I knew that he was a Freemason. And I really didn't know much about them at all. I actually just kind of considered them to be like a fraternity that did, work with the community. And that's how naive I was, actually. So I started digging into my grandfather, his connections with the Freemasons in this little town, this tiny little town. I really didn't actually find out much about his connections to them. My best guess is that he was a very low level Freemason and didn't really know what they were all about. But in that small a town, I can imagine, because it really hasn't changed much since, that it's really is kind of like a fraternity. They help each other out, in that little tiny town, helping each other get jobs or if someone's sick, that kind of a thing. But what it really did send me on was this journey discovering all about the Freemasons themselves. And that was a rabbit hole that led to a bunch of other rabbit holes of other secret societies. And when I took a step back and started looking at all these secret societies and their agendas and, connecting all of them, it really did paint this picture about how for centuries a select group of elite people have been plotting the demise of the rest of us for centuries. And it just really opened my eyes. And I started digging into so many other things like the intelligence communities and black projects and everything else. I just had this aha moment. That was an aha moment for me. And it got to the point where I couldn't stand on the sidelines anymore and just do nothing. And I tried to talk to people, but most of the people I talked to just really weren't ready to receive that information yet. And so that's why I came here to social media to try to do my part to wake other people up. And that's how I found, this community of people and joined in this thing that we refer to as the Great Awakening.
And the Great Awakening has many meanings, and like you said, a lot of people see it differently. I've got different views on it. I don't think we're in an awakening yet. I think this point in time where we are, we have a chance to create a Great Awakening. That's my that's my take on it, or how I see it at the moment. I believe there's certain things that have to happen for this to actually be a Great Awakening.
Oh, well, I see it differently. I do see that a lot of signs of a Great Awakening happening worldwide. A lot of people waking up to the lies of the narrative that they've been fed for so long, and on many different agendas, whether it's from vaccines to the media to corrupt governments to tyranny. But I do see a lot of evidence that there's a mass scale awakening. I do want to share one comment that is a personal story of someone named Shanna who replied to our comments, and she said, "I woke up many years ago realizing that my whole damn life was basically a freaking lie. Took me a while to wake up hubby and my kids. The Great Awakening for me was to learn just how evil and corrupt this whole damn system is. These people are sick, evil, and very corrupt." And I think there's millions of people's and stories around the world like Shanna's. The Great Awakening's very personal to each of us, but it's also global, I think.
Oh, 100%, it's global. But what I was referring to as in a Great Awakening, I mean as a great mass awakening that will actually bring change. I think there's a few things that need to happen. That doesn't take away from personal awakenings happening all around the place, like spot fires happening all around the place. But I believe we need to see some really significant things for this to be classified a Great Awakening, because there has been Great Awakenings in the past. Well, for the scholars kind of put it down to. A lot of them generally are based on religion, though, a religious Great Awakening, and I think we're at a time now where this Great Awakening is a lot different than just simply being a religious one, because there's a lot of people out there, whether religious, whether spiritual or not, that are waking up.
Yes, I agree that it's not wholly just one thing. There is a spiritual aspect to it, in my opinion, and many people relate to that aspect to it more so than others. But there are many levels to this, and that's why I kind of wanted to break it down. So let's talk about the awakening that's happening before our eyes on this global scale. Speaker, I know that you follow protests around the world, and that's something that you report on really well. I mean, I actually, kind of depend on you and your reporting of these things. So there's too many examples to list them all, but what are some of the examples of the masses waking up to tyranny that have been imposed on us that stick out in your mind?
Well, 2019 was really the year of the protest. We saw Hong Kong, we saw the yellow vest. The yellow vests were the big ones. There was a big awakening in France through that, and through Europe. In Asia, Hong Kong was the big one, and now we've just got Thailand. But we've seen these ripples all across the world. But you also got to remember, not all protests are created equal. I mean, we had protests in Chile, which was a lot more of a Marxist protests. We're having protests in Belarus and all that, which seems to be a little bit more Marxist. So it's very important for people to look
D-
and pay attention to this.
differentiate because yeah, I mean
100%.
we have BLM protests happening over here in the States, but we also have people protesting the masks, the tyranny, that kind of a thing. So two totally different agendas there.
Mm.
But and I remember seeing protests in Europe as well, with the masks and these mandates and that are tyrannical. So it seems like it's really it is global.
Definitely, for a large amount of people, they are waking up and seeing how destructive some power structures can be. Um, and what's important about that, and I think it's something people in the West seem to forget. Definitely, the social justice warriors and the progressives seem to forget that a lot of countries around the world are not run like a democratic republic or a democracy. I mean, most countries don't have these votes every 4 years to elect a new leader, or and those things don't happen in the majority of countries. I mean, you got the Prime Minister of Azerbaijan's been there for 26 years. I mean, Putin controls with an iron fist. Xi controls with an iron fist. I mean, there's.
You could even speak of Victoria and the kind of lockdowns and just tyrannical rules that they've had over there. I mean, it doesn't even I don't even recognize this world sometimes with
Hmm.
these kind of mandates.
It's good. It's gone to hell. But with with those other big countries, especially countries like China and all that, that's why you've got people in Hong Kong. Well, it's around 8 million people in Hong Kong that rose up against the Chinese government because of that. Now that creates impact and change, and that shows the world that these countries that are run by dictators is not what they say they are. Don't buy their bullshit. And that is what these protests, I think, signify to the world, which is really important, especially when you've got, uh, you know, multi-million-dollar athletes and actors and actresses sitting there bowing their head to these overseas foreign dictators just because they're getting money from them, and companies like Nike and Adidas, companies like that are getting half their slave labor from these countries. So a great awakening, to me, is more people understanding this, and more
Right.
people seeing and breaking the power dynamics that have always been in our faces. Yet we don't want to talk about them, or we think we can't do anything about them.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to read some comments from people on Twitter on what the Great Awakening means to them. And some of these comments were speaking to the masses waking up globally. So Gino wrote, "The Great Awakening is a worldwide spiritual and political movement that has brought the voiceless masses to the forefront. We, the people, have shaken the elite class, and they will be held accountable." So I thought that was a really good comment. Amy wrote, "It's the realization that we allowed the government to take our freedoms and liberties because we were too lazy to fight to keep them. Now we must fight to get them back before it's too late." And the last one I wanted to read is, before we move on, is our friend Severe wrote, "The Great Awakening means a global reset. awakening to how deeply the evil is actually rooted, and total refusal to submit to their tyranny any longer. So I thought that was well said.
Yeah, they're very solid. I like them, and like we said, we are not going to sit here and tell people how to think. That is never the purpose of our channel. We're just here to tell you how we think, and maybe you might agree with it, but that is what separates us at the moment from big tech and from the mainstream media, is that we know sometimes we can be wrong. We know sometimes that our friends that have been kicked off these platforms can get things wrong. We can, but that's how we find out the truth. We find out the truth by working around these corners and learning new things and putting things together and throwing away things that don't add up.
And it's not up to big tech oligarchs to decide what's truth and not. It's up to we the people. It is our job to sift through and decide and research for ourselves. But we can't even do that if the information has been censored from us, because someone who deems themselves to be more intelligent or more informed decides for us what we can and can't read, watch, understand. But
And that's the problem. That is the hive mind that they're trying to put together at the moment. They think that it's going to create a more, whether they all think that it's debatable, but it's just the best way to explain it. They think it's going to create a more harmonious society if you all agree with one another, or if you all accept the narrative. That way we can all just get along and do whatever, while behind the scenes everything's getting taken away from us.
yep,
It is to create a docile society.
it's psychological warfare, and that's probably a good segue to talk about this next layer of the Great Awakening, is the psychological side of it. It's not just a physical one, it's psychological. People are waking up to the fact that we've been lied to, and that all these institutions that we've been led to trust, like the media, like our educational systems, have been in on perpetuating those lies. And that's a tough pill to swallow, to realize that pretty much all your life you've been lied to or information has been withheld from you.
And it's very purposely done. It's very purposely to create this docile, acceptable society without questioning what's going on, um, in your peripheral vision. That's the best way to put it. They've just got you looking forward in life and telling you this is what you do, this is what you do, but they don't want you to look to the left or look to the right.
Yeah, and this has been going on for centuries. But if you could just look back and decades past. Edward Bernays, he's the father of public relations, and he's actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So what does that tell you? But he literally wrote the book on propaganda. I'm just going to read a quote from it, because it does actually ring true about what they're doing right now. It says, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." I mean, that is exactly what is happening to us.
Mm.
And it's really just an illusion of freedom and democracy.
Oh, 100%. What we've stumbled into this is into this hybrid of, 1984 and A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It seems like those two books have kind of molded together to create what we're dealing with now. It's very weird.
It is. I do feel like I'm living in a sci-fi novel right now. I want to read a couple comments about the psychological warfare that we're experiencing right now. Karen McLaughlin wrote that the Great Awakening is freedom to think for yourself by questioning everything, not being fed information daily by one or two sources and regarding it as truth. deductive reasoning based on facts and logical thinking to find the truth. So that's what we're lacking a lot these days is deductive reasoning, critical thinking. And we've all of our lives been led to just take information and accept it as truth.
Critical thinking is a big one. It's weird when you see a lot of these people in universities and a lot of these kids and how they don't have any critical thinking. It's really scary. You can ask them simple things and they don't know how to respond.
I know. It really is like they've been brainwashed because they have. And the truth is, we've actually all been brainwashed, and there's some of us that have woken up to that. And I think that's really part of what the Great Awakening is all about, is breaking free from that brainwashing that we have been fed. But Panic wrote on Twitter, and this is kind of another sci-fi comparison to what's currently happening. Panic compared what we're going through to the Matrix, which is a common analogy that we use in the Great Awakening. But Panic wrote, the Great Awakening is the escape from large-scale behavioral control through narrative manipulation. Once free from the Matrix, there is a flood of new information. All info is not good info. So the next battle is to distill the truth. Perspective is the prize in the end. And that again speaks to how we need critical thinking skills. We're grown-ups. We can handle information in all forms, okay? And sometimes the source isn't necessarily a good source, or the information isn't always perfectly correct, whatever the case is, but we can handle it and we can research for ourselves and distill the truth. That's where critical thinking comes into play. And when we have big tech oligarchs and mainstream media and educational institutions deciding for us what we can and cannot research, or what information we are not allowed to have access to, then we are no longer able to get all of the information and distill the truth.
It's a good way to put it.
So let's go a layer deeper and talk about how the Great Awakening is also, there's a spiritual element to it. I want to dive into that. For me, it is a very important aspect of the Great Awakening. When I realized the depths and the horrors that of the true evil that we were really up against, then I really did come to an understanding that we're truly in a spiritual war, and it's a battle of good versus evil. What do you think?
I think it's an accurate way to put it. I think the spiritual awakenings can be different to great awakenings. I think a lot of people have separate spiritual awakenings, that there is good and evil versus the world. I don't think. I think I see the two as different. So a spiritual awakening and a great awakening.
I think they can be different, and then I also think that they can be part of the same. I think that a spiritual awakening is a very personal one. It's something that it's just directly connecting you with your spiritual beliefs, with God, with the source. But also you can see it happening on a grand scale with these, especially lately, I've seen several revivals happening in protest to these lockdowns, like say in California, for example, that to me are kind of part of the Great Awakening. Maybe some people in that group who are part of that revival would identify as being part of the Great Awakening, and some wouldn't. So I understand where you're coming from. They're kind of separate, but somewhere there's like a middle ground between them.
Yeah, I think it can have overlaps, of course, with some people within a great awakening.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that that term, the Great Awakening, which has recently been coined, I'd say, in, the last couple of years, but it's not actually a new term at all. And you'd referred to this earlier on. It was used to describe a moment in American history back in the 1700s. There was this huge revival termed as the Great Awakening in the American colonies, and it was kind of in contrast to a movement that was going on at the time. It was a secular movement, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. It was this popular ideology that really just emphasized science and logic over religion. And so this revival took place back in the early 1700s that they called the Great Awakening. And it was really just a return to scripture. It emphasized a personal relationship with God and the love and grace of God. And that Great Awakening actually had a massive impact on American history. And here's where we get into, because you were saying that the Great Awakening isn't just a spiritual thing, that it's also like waking up to the tyranny,
Now I think it has mutated, and not in a bad way, not a bad mutated, but I think now because of the world that we live in, the the way that we're all connected, the way that all different religions form, the way that we're so multicultural, that I think it has taken on a, a different form in a
mm-hmm.
way. A lot of the same characteristics, but I think now, like I explained earlier, that there's just more factors.
Yeah. Because we're all not the same. And that's what's interesting about it is, and that's why we're actually talking about it, because people interpret the Great Awakening to mean different things. And that's why we also wanted comments from our followers, so that they could give their input on what they think it means. Because it's not just about what you and I think it means, it's what we kind of all collectively think it means. And it can mean many different things. But this Great Awakening back in the 1700s, it really wasn't just a spiritual Great Awakening. It actually played a part, historians believe, in influencing the American Revolution, because they weren't just talking about the biblical beliefs, they were also promoting nationalism and individual rights. So I find the parallels to that Great Awakening in the early 1700s that really did influence the and spark contribute to sparking the American Revolution to today and the Great Awakening that's happening now. And it is a kind of revolutionary time where we are trying to start a paradigm shift away from a government that was imposing tyranny on us and regaining our freedoms. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to before. The way I see a great awakening, I see awakenings and spiritual awakenings differently. Um, but I see a great awakening, and the way I interpret a great awakening is an uh, something, a catalyst that has created something that will lead to everlasting change in a positive way, or a revealing way. So to reveal something that hasn't been that has been hidden for years, but that has actually led to that change. Not that it started and then fizzled out. And that's why I said before, there's a few things that I believe need to happen for me to accept this as a full great awakening.
I
And
guess I
what
understand what you're saying. Like you would
yeah.
prefer to look back on it in hindsight and say, okay, well, how did this, actually affect change? Because we are still in the midst of it.
Mm,
I am incredibly encouraged by it, and I do believe that we will prevail. But I guess hindsight is always the best way to go for these things to see, really how much impact the Great
mm.
Awakening does have on affecting change on the globe. I want to read a few comments real quick. Is there something you wanted to say first?
Um, yeah, I can go into this really deep for a long time, but we just don't have the time here. But so some of the things that I believe need to happen in my own perspective is that, one, we need Trump to have another term.
Yes.
Uh, Two, we need to see justice served for those that have committed crimes, and not just a slap on a wrist or a subpoena or a court thing. We need to see actually people jailed.
Yes.
and people facing full justice of the law so the world can see it in turn, and that will spark global thought on a bigger level. We need mainstream media and all that to be caught up in that justice system.
Yes,
Um,
we need more freedom as far as freedom of speech. We can't have the censorship that we're currently under right now.
no. Those things have to be completely gone. Those things have to be completely eradicated for us to have and to start on a new path from academia to mainstream media to big tech. Um, but those are some of the main things that I believe that we have to see for us to push us on a path to a more enlightened future. And one other thing is the revelation and the reveal of old secrets and things that people have thought to be taboo to come to the forefront, such as Satanism and such as these sort of things, that is relevant within these people and culture.
Yes. I do want to read some comments going back to this spiritual level of the Great Awakening, because that's what several people really do identify with as part of being part of this movement. And Simply Irredeemable wrote, "The Great Awakening is our nation cleansing its soul." Simple but profound, really. And Rods from God wrote, "People are reconnecting to Source, God. Through His glory, we heard the call to rise, hear hard truths, and see evil for what it is, to protect our fellow man from Satan's grip. Awakening the masses into the new era, peace through Jesus Christ, patriotism and love, not hate and destruction." And Nicole wrote, "The Great Awakening for me is the moment when a large majority of people will wake up from the deep sleep and realize they are more than garbage, but spiritual beings." And that's interesting because it really, we do sometimes feel like that is the way we're treated. Like there is an unjust system. Like we, the people, are just nothing. We're just garbage to them. But the truth is, we are spiritual beings, and we have more power than we know. And they are terrified of that once we realize our own power.
And there's so many other good ones. I'm sorry that we couldn't bring them all up, but we'll scroll down during the video anyway, so you can read them through. But there are some really good ones.
There are. So I think that's a great way to leave it. We are in this battle, and we are in the thick of it. And sometimes it's hard to see the good. But I have hope, and especially after reading all of these comments and connecting with all of you amazing people, I know that we'll prevail. I really truly believe that in my heart, that we will prevail. But we are in the midst of a war right now, an information war. And
It, it is a battle, and no matter what happens, though, we can't stop doing what we're doing. I mean, those individuals that are awake now, that are a part of this, no matter what happens, I don't think we can ever stop trying to achieve this thing that we want.
it's worth the fight.
100%.
I would rather die for my freedom than lay down under a tyrannical rule. To me, it's just there's no choice, in my opinion. I have to fight for this. There's nothing more important worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in it with you guys, and we feel bad for our fallen friends. But we're all in this together, and we'll make it through. We will. So thanks for joining us today here on Hive Mind. Please be sure to share this podcast, and we will see you back next time, right here on Hive Mind.